know that you can access at a later stage, and also then just to be aware that what you're saying is being recorded, that there's that. Before proceeding any further, I would like to welcome Auntie Donna to do the official welcome to country. Auntie Donna's Aboriginal family connections are of the Wurundjeri of the Central West New South Wales coast. She's the mother of 4 adult children and grandmother of 5 so far. She was born and raised in Sydney on Gadigal land and is proud to be a cultural representative for the local Aboriginal community in Sydney for the past 35 years, mainly in the area of education. She was also elected to represent her community as a councillor on the former Sydney Regional Council of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Community Commission, which is ATSIC. Please welcome Auntie Donna.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's my great pleasure to be here with permission from my elders to offer you welcome to country for today's virtual launch of Women of Colour Australia. It gives me pride to represent my community in this important cultural protocol. It shows respect for and recognition to the unique position of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australian culture and history. We are presenting to you from the traditional land of the Gadigal, who are one of 29 clans of the Eora Nation, which is bordered by the Hawkesbury, the Georges and the Nepean rivers. I'm an Aboriginal woman who proudly identifies with the Wiradjuri Nation from Central West New South Wales. I was born on Gadigal land and I've had the privilege to live, work and raise my 4 children on this land for most of my life. My family has grown and I'm now a proud grandmother to Aaliyah, Elijah, Lakota, Kalila and Jake Jr. 3 of my grandchildren are female and I hope that they enjoy the same opportunities as my grandsons. I count myself truly fortunate that I was raised with many strong Black women in my life. I have benefited from their leadership and guidance, and my grandchildren will also benefit from their wisdom and their strength. I acknowledge the Gadigal and all nations represented today. Their spirits and ancestors will always remain with the land Mother Earth, and I thank them for their ongoing custodianship of country. I pay my respects to our elders, both past and present, and we must never forget the sacrifices made by our leaders, especially women, to create a better future for Aboriginal people. I do this as a reminder and as a tribute to elders and those who have gone before us to fight for land rights, justice and equity for our communities. I extend my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and other people of colour from all clans, nations and countries who are viewing this afternoon. I also recognise our non-Aboriginal sisters and brothers who walk beside us to celebrate our successes. At this point, I would normally say I now offer you a warm and sincere welcome to the land of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. Wish you a safe stay on the land and safe travel from the land. I have the same wish for you all, whichever country you are viewing from. On behalf of my community and the Gadigal, I wish you a fantastic afternoon at today's launch of Women of Colour Australia, where you will learn about current plans, meet the board and find out the results of the first ever Women of Colour in the Workplace survey. I look forward to the timely and important panel discussion, Women of Colour in Leadership, Beyond Default Views and Perspectives, with some of Australia's most prominent and inspiring women of colour who we are honoured to be hearing from today. In closing, we remember that this is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. Thanks everyone, have a great time.
Thank you, Auntie Donna. Thank you so much. It's lovely and very special to have that welcome today from you, in solidarity with all of us. I know it really is essential to, I think, the integrity of an event like this, that we can start it this way. So thank you for those beautiful words and welcome. Again, as Auntie mentioned, we have some incredible trailblazers and fierce, I guess, representatives of women of colour from across the country here today. And, you know, again, I would like to see you enter the parts of Australia that you are coming from so that we can actually get a sense of how broad and encompassing the reach is of this message and certainly of this organisation. And I just want to give, I guess, a little bit of an overview of what I think both drives the existence of an entity like Women of Colour Australia and also this particular event, which, as Andy pointed out, is called Women of Colour and Leadership, Beyond Default Views and Perspectives. Okay, and just before we go on, I might have to do that thing where I ask everyone to mute themselves if they're not speaking, just so that we can maximise the audio clarity. that's okay. So this organisation has been established now. This is probably its first year of actually getting on the ground, making a name for itself, and I guess forging a pathway in amongst a midst of people of colour initiatives globally that are responding to the issue of marginalisation of minority voices who are accomplishing so much on the sidelines, but often having their broader accomplishments either stolen, minimised, or in some cases completely ignored. And I look at this particular entity as a platform of, or a collaboration of people with the same agenda, which is to lift each other, support one another against a system or systemic biases that seek to entrench these voices for a myriad of reasons. And the report that Brenda will speak to shortly is evidence of that. It's evidence of the fact that we know that women of colour are out there in droves in this country and nationally, doing often the hard work, but getting either underpaid, definitely, undervalued, and in many cases exploited as a result of it. So it's what do we do with this data and how do we respond to it in a climate where we've seen racism and races against women of colour in particular manifest in the workplace? And we're talking across the board here. We're talking in corporate settings, in business settings, small business, in schools, in universities, in the sports theatre, in the media, in the arts sector. And one thing that we can see is that racism is not going anywhere. Our awareness of it, our ability to map it is improved, but we're not going anywhere either. And I think that's really important. To me, it's like we're here to stay and we're here to table it. We're here to make a noise about it. But more important than that, we're here to provide some constructive ways of eradicating it and holding to account those who perpetrate it and the systems that enable it. It's a huge feat. And I don't for a minute think that we are one organisation that can dismantle the racial patriarchy, if that's a concept, but I do think we can go some way in destabilising it, and that's not a bad thing. So I welcome this event and those who are participating in it for doing their part in making a constructive noise and collaborating with each other in order to upturn the status quo. Before proceeding with introducing the amazing panel, I think it would only be fitting that we start off today's proceedings with some words from Brenda Gaddy, who you would all know. So Brenda, I have to admit, I just met her since I joined the Women of Colour entity. That was probably in December of last year when she asked me to be an ambassador. And I'm like, who's this Brenda? You know, really? And then I did my work, and then I came to know, and I've seen the work that she's done, and she's tireless. And she gets results. So she's the kind of woman you want at the helm of an organisation that is in its seeding foundation, because she makes sure that it doesn't sink, that it gets out there. She keeps the momentum up. And it's not just any old organisation, it's an organisation that's close to our hearts, both professionally and personally, because it hits the nerve that, you know, that we can all relate to, of what it means to be silenced and marginalised. So I'd like to welcome Brenda Gaddy, who's the Managing Director and founder of Women of Colour Australia, to speak to why, the organisation was formed, and why was this report commissioned, which the panel will speak to shortly. Please welcome Brenda.
Thanks, Tasneem. Before I talk, I would like to acknowledge the Wallumattagal clan of the Darug Nation as the traditional custodians of the land upon which Women of Colour Australia is situated, and which I'm zooming in from. I pay my respects to the elders, past and present, and I acknowledge and honor the strength and resilience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women with whom we stand in solidarity. I acknowledge, as a settler on this stolen land, I am the direct beneficiary of the genocide and ongoing colonial violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And I think it's our collective responsibility to help dismantle, destabilize the structural inequities and oppressive structures oppressing the original inhabitants of this land. This land is and always will be Aboriginal land. Sovereignty was never ceded. And I'd also like to extend my acknowledgement and thanks to Auntie Donna for doing the welcome to the country. And I also like to extend my acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who are with us today and who will probably watch us later on. All right, so that's a long one. With me, as Tasneem said, starting this organization is deeply, deeply personal for me. I'm not sure if any of you have, if you read my story, I've shared it on the website, but it's a love letter to my mother who passed away last year. Her name is Electa, and she's a tiny, tiny woman. She's 4 feet 9 inches. And she came to Australia in the early 80s and off the back of the White Australia policy. She was a very proud woman. She never talked about, the racism and discrimination she experienced, but I knew it in my heart that she caught a lot of it. And because, she didn't even finish university, so navigating her way around, the white spaces must have been so hard. So when she passed, I went into deep depression and I thought I was coping and I wasn't. So in my deepest and darkest place, I asked myself, what can I do to channel this grief and this sadness to honor my mom? And because I've been involved, my strength, if you will, is community organizing. I've always loved putting people together and networking and things like that. So I said to myself, maybe I could put together this organization for women who look like me, who sound like me, and women who have been racialized and minoritized in the white-centered society. And so I am a digital marketer by trade, and I have an entrepreneurial background as well. So I harness those powers and decide, you know what, I'm just gonna do this. And then I was very fortunate enough to find my awesome board members. Dr. Pilar is here, Athena, Shane, but we'll introduce them to you guys later on as well. Hopefully we'll have time. But these women are all volunteers, and I'm just so grateful that they're standing with me and with all of us. So I'm just so grateful about that. So that's the personal bit. And the professional bit, I suppose, where the organization is, yes, we're about racial justice, but we're about economic justice as well. Because as Tasneem said, I told her this many times, when I stumbled upon her SBS Voices article, it's just that, oh my God, Tasneem is going to be my ambassador. From day one, I wanted her. So anyway, in there, she said, women of color, we don't lack the agency. We don't lack the capability. What we lack are the opportunities. So it is our hope that our organization will be part of that, unlocking those opportunities. So that's pretty much us. And then I'll hand over to our lovely chair, Dr. Pilar Kasat, who will talk a bit more about the survey. And just to, on a personal level, when I was reading the very first time I read the rollout of the survey, I think it was about close to 200 pages. I had to step out, I have to stay away, I have to step back because it was just heartbreaking. And these women, they're at the top of their game, high income earners, no children, so really focused on their careers, and they're still experiencing the microaggressions, discrimination, and all these things. And it was just so heartbreaking. So we will share the report, the full copy of the report after the event. So you guys will have the chance to read for yourself. But I thank those women who trusted us with their stories. And with that, I'm handing over to our lovely chair, Dr. Pilar. She's all the way from WA.
Thank you. Thank you, Brenda. I too would really like to thank you, Donna Ingram, for the warm welcome to country, and truly echo Brenda's words in relation to us being on a settler colonial society. I am coming to you from Whadjuk country of the Noongar Nation, which is at the southwest of Western Australia. I think it's very fitting that Brenda has given us this personal account. For many, our personal narratives may be an indulgence, but it's not at all. Our personal narratives are an important way in which we actually combat patriarchal and white supremacy. So that was really beautiful. Thank you, Brenda, for sharing that very candid and very heartfelt reason why this organization is founded. And Brenda it's incredible. She has, in somebody's group of women, and she's great at asking, and we all so committed to the purpose of the organization that we all have said, yes, we want to go along with this vision, because we believe that this is incredibly important. We have been silenced, and it's time, as also Tasneem said, there's a global movement, and I think it's really important to understand that this is what's happening here now in Australia today. Forms part of a movement in which women across the globe, and particularly across the global south, are really rising, are really taking up space, and we are articulating, that we here, we exist, and we deserve better. In terms of the survey will be available, so you can actually, at your leisure, have a look at it. But I'm just going to point some really key points that hopefully will help us with the discussion. So the purpose of this survey was really to explore the professional experience of women of color in the workplace, and this is something that we don't have any really data. Our capacity to segregate the data in relation to what's happening with gender inequality, we don't have this. And for this very reason, this survey is particularly important. And these key points that I'm going to highlight are really valuable for us as a starting point, and also as a bit of a tip of the iceberg. So the things that really struck me the most was that 60% of women of color are reporting experiencing prejudice and discrimination in the workplace. That is a figure that I don't know how you feel about it. I think it's outrageous, and also it needs to be unpacked further. But interestingly, this figure is very similar to what the Diversity Council of Australia, together with the Jambana Institute for Indigenous Education and Research, so in First Nations people report discrimination in the workplace at more or less the same rate, which I think is really important to put some of these things into context. The other thing that I thought it was fascinating was that 59% of women say that they have diversity and equity plans in place in their workplaces. So the question obviously is, what are these diversity and inclusion plans doing if 60% of women are feeling discriminated in the workplace? So that I'm hoping that the panel would pick that in specific. What are these plans doing or not doing, and how they need to be improved, and who needs to be sitting perhaps at the table. I've seen a few of equity and diversity plans, and what I found fascinating that the rhetoric, it's all aspirational, and you can't quite, it's all good. And however, the strategies don't seem to match up to the aspirational. Now, the other thing that I thought it was interesting, 72% of the respondents were women in the age bracket of 25 to 44. So the majority of respondents are younger women, and also women that are earning in the higher income bracket. So we've got a cohort of women who are earning between $100,000 and $149,000 a year. Now, my immediate question is to wonder why all the women didn't respond. Was it something in the survey, or perhaps the name of the survey that didn't attract the response of older women? But again, something maybe it'll be good for discussion. Why are we not? We don't have a lot of data then on older women. Now, 57% of women reported facing challenges that are specifically related to their identity. So we've got women in the workplace whose identity, some of us perhaps, have been trying or to approximate to whiteness to be able to operate and to be able to be accepted in the workplace. And obviously, this is not acceptable. Yeah, we want women in the workplace who can bring all of themselves into workplace. Like for me today, it's really quite special because it's very rare to be talking to a public where my exotic looks, my funny accent is actually embraced, and I know that I thank you because I feel understood in this group among you all. What we need now, the other part of what I want to talk about in terms of how we contextualize this data is the Australian Workplace Gender and Equity Agency said that it will take 20 years for women to get salary parity in management roles, but it will take 80 years for that woman to be the CEO. Now, that is not accounting race, and this stats race is not has not been, if you like, scrutinized. So we really need a much more intersectional lens to be able to look at this issue, obviously, and we need to desegregate the data. But this is the beginning. I like to think that we'll be able to do this every year, so we can really begin to build a picture for the future. And probably that's enough for me, Tasneem, as a bit of an intro.
Thank you, Pilar. There's a lot that you've raised there that I think will make for great conversation points with the panel, who I do want to introduce now. Just a lot of you will be familiar with who these speakers are, but I'm going to give a brief introduction for those of you who may not be familiar with them. And the first person I wanted to introduce is Mariam Vaizada. So Mariam is a passionate diversity and inclusion advocate. She's established herself as an energetic and resourceful change maker by continuously going above and beyond her day job to influence positive change in society. Her influence has been felt in many initiatives she promotes across her social media platforms. She's also a board director with the Diversity Council of Australia. So welcome, Mariam. Next up, we have Carly Stanley. She's a CEO and founder of Deadly Connections, an Aboriginal community-led non-profit service providing support to Aboriginal people, families and communities, particularly those impacted by child protection and or under the justice system. She's a proud Wiradjuri woman, and raised on Gadigal land. Next up, we have Antoinette Latouf. Antoinette is a multi-award winning journalist and a WoCA finalist and has worked on a range of news and current affairs programs at the SBS, ABC, Network 10 and Triple J. In 2019, she was named one of the Australian Financial Review's 100 most influential women. She's also a director and co-founder of Media Diversity Australia, which is a not-for-profit seeking to increase cultural and linguistic diversity in mainstream media. She's currently writing her first book, How to Lose Friends and Influence White People. Please welcome Antoinette. Next up, we have Kat Henway. Kat is a descendant of the Meriam and Moa peoples of the Torres Strait Islands. She's the founder and CEO of Women's Business, whose mission is to amplify and empower women of colour in leadership. She's also founded Politics in Colour to enable people from underserved communities into pathways of political leadership. Finally, we have JULIANA. She's from the Domestic and Family Violence Project Management of Settlement Services International. She's passionate about social justice and leadership, and particularly fired by the issue of voice, giving people the opportunities to find and express their voice in the right places. She's also passionate about human rights and women's rights around building African women in Australia. So please welcome JULIANA. Now, thank you. I hope I've got everybody there, but thank you all for being present and being part of this conversation. And I'm just going to start by asking you a really simple question, I guess at the outset, of why women's voices of women of colour's voices now, and what difference could this research possibly make? Okay, so it's kind of being deliberately provocative, but I'll ask you that, Mariam, first. Why now?
Thanks, Tasneem. And I too am joining everyone from Camaragal country, and I'd like to acknowledge its traditional owners and past, present and emerging. As to your question, why now? I suppose it's a question that's been relevant for a really long time. There has been some research done into the experiences of exclusion for women of colour in broader society, but one thing that I think has been missing from the conversation is applying a really analytical, intersectional lens to all of this, and that's what this is exciting to know. When I heard about this organisation that Brenda has started, and then this incredible work and launch that you're doing today, it is giving voice to a segment of the community which for a long time hasn't really had a voice. So I'm in a management position at Diversity Council Australia, and I'm really privileged to be able to do this work on a regular basis now as my day job. And before I even joined this Diversity Council Australia, when I was sort of researching this area, I guess it's something that I have lived experience in and a personal passion education, both, you know, professionally and personally, and there was very little data on women of colour. There was very little data to the intersectional nature of the experiences of women women of colour in the workforce, and all that existed was Diversity Council Australia's research around cracking the glass cultural ceiling, and those findings aren't necessarily shocking to anyone. It's very much tells the story of one that many of us are very familiar with, and that is that despite the incredible abilities and merit and ambition and capabilities that women of colour have, they're very much locked out of leadership positions. And when they did an analysis in 2015, analysis of ASX directors who were women, 2 out of 100 were culturally diverse women. So those stats are kind of all that we had to go off, and so therefore this is a conversation that needs to keep going. One thing that is happening, which I'll just quickly mention, is that in addition to looking at the fact that there is a pay gap, a gender pay gap, now there's going to be a focus on looking at the cultural, you know, the gender pay gap when it comes to culturally diverse women, which I think will be really interesting findings.
Yeah, that takes it up a notch for sure.
Yes.
Thank you. That's another lens. Kat, can I ask you, why now? Why does it matter?
Well, I think absolutely the Black Lives Matter movement last year has certainly triggered, you know, a real surge and a real mobilisation of empowerment, you know, for people of colour, and I think that's definitely influenced the rise in empowerment of women of colour. Certainly we see across America, this has been really, really obvious and played out in politics, particularly with the election of Kamala Harris as the first woman of colour vice president. So that, along with post-Black Lives Matter mobilisation and visibility of women of colour, I think is really influencing what's going on here in Australia. One of the reasons I set up women's business was because I had seen and experienced a great deal of discrimination and in Australian workplaces, and a lot of that was towards women of colour. I'd been trying to promote and uplift many very, very highly educated Aboriginal women who were academics in a particular university, and I saw people treat these women appallingly, and then that treatment was sort of meted out onto me. And so after I had experienced racial bullying a number of times in Australian organisations, I decided that was enough for me. I left and decided to set up women's business. And women's business is really about creating a platform to amplify women of colour in leadership, because I really felt like this country has a problem seeing women of colour in leadership as valid and valuable. And little did I know that a couple of years later, the Black Lives Matter movement would occur, and amazing organisations like, you know, this one, Women of Colour and Allies, would spring up, and lots of organisations like this. So I guess to sum it up, and I'm going to use the title of Stacey Abrams' latest book. She's the governor of Georgia, the African American woman, and her latest book is entitled "Our Time Is Now." And I absolutely believe that if we look at what's happening in America, what's happening globally, absolutely our time is now.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you. Antoinette, if I can ask you now, I mean, how do we use this data, and how do we leverage this data to influence white people?
I think I'll just build on the fantastic responses we've already heard. This moment, I'll quickly just answer why now. Sorry, I'm just losing my voice a little bit, so bear with me. Why now? Obviously, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, we've seen these big global movements, but what we've also seen with Me Too, despite how it originated in the United States, was it really came to fruition or made headlines when some very middle class, very pretty, very white actresses took the centre stage. And I think what I also have witnessed time and time again in an Australian context, when we're talking about any diversity initiatives or gender initiatives, that it's dominated by white women, and even go as far as say dominated by blonde white women. And so I think there's a real sense that this does not include us. This is, you know, I'm sick of the International Women's Day breakfasts that are a bunch of women from the, you know, the same sort of suburbs who went to the same sort of schools, who kind of look the same, all sitting around explaining their very similar lived experiences. Not to say their lived experiences aren't valid, they're valid, but they're monopolising the debate, and they don't take into any consideration intersectionality when we talk about women of colour or women who live with a disability or women who are LGBTQI or Indigenous women. Because, or, you know, every time you add that layer of intersectionality, it becomes more complex and it's more problematic and it's harder. So I think why now is because there's a frustration and there's a sense that for too long, women of colour have been excluded. I, as a woman of colour, also feel since Black Lives Matter that I need to do more to use my voice to amplify the experiences of Indigenous people and, you know, particularly Indigenous women. So that's, I guess, for me, why now and why women of colour is so important. And also data matters. We know that data doesn't necessarily change people's minds, but it's a start to measure. You know, I emceed earlier this year, or perhaps it was late last year, WoCA, the Women's Gender Equality Agency's data. And one of the things I raised was, you know, what's lacking in this data is it doesn't capture the nuances. Like if we looked at what a refugee or migrant woman, or if we actually had that data, we'd be able to actually be better able to unpack just how challenging the issue is, because it would be so much more challenging. The wage disparity, representation, so much more horrendous, to be frank, and more challenging. So I think we need to have these conversations. We need to have this data, because then it's hard to look away. And don't worry, people will still try and look away. But then when you repeat it in a year's time or in 2 years' time, and you're able to say, hey, there's no progress, or in a little bit of progress, or gender diversity initiatives are only supporting or promoting a certain type of woman who is and looks like this, then you've got, you know, you can make a bit more noise and you can hopefully enlist more people to the cause. So yeah, that's my why now and why data is so essential.
No, it is. Yeah. And thank you for, this certainly does provide that nice little cohort of data that is missing from the public conversation. JULIANA, welcome. And can I ask you why now, and why does this report matter to you?
Thank you very much. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land on which I live and on which I have had opportunity to occupy, and thank the Indigenous people for their absolute generosity for allowing us all to be here. Why now? Why not now? Thank you very much, Brenda, because when I had a first conversation with you, you know, the sort of sentiments that I expressed. And I went to Loretta Ross, who explained the origins of people of color, women of color, in 1977, during the Decade for Women, when the Black women presented an agenda and then opened the door for solidarity for all women of color. And then she says, when you shake the bottom of the pyramid, the whole pyramid shakes. So why now is, it's great that today in 2021, we can get together and start to shake the bottom of the pyramid. And when we do, then the whole pyramid will struggle, because then they have to contend with who we are. And if we are 40, 50, 60% of the population, then boy, that pyramid will have to come down. So I think I'm coming to the point where I'm saying, for people of color, women of color, it's about identity politics. Moving away from identity politics into politics of solidarity. I'm saying this for myself, and I'm saying this for the people I represent, that we need to move away from identity politics as only as Black women, and begin to go into solidarity politics as women of color. In Australia, we make up a whole heap of people, and therefore we need to really strengthen our position and our voices and make sure that what is our issues come to the fore as a group of people and not as siloed individual groups of people. I want to respond to the question of age in the statistics that came out. And I smiled because I realized that people of my age group, that is anybody in their 60s, anybody in their 50s, anybody in their 40s, were not represented, mainly. And why so?
Yeah, no, that's...
And why so? And I smiled to myself because I didn't even see the survey myself. But if I'm a leader of a whole group of people and I didn't see how many other people missed it. And why did they miss it? Because it's a digital world and the people in my age group of color don't play in this digital world. So how are we going to get their voices in the next lot of the survey? Because their voices are extremely important. And somebody talked about feminism that I listened to, and I've been listening to a lot, and talking about feminism of color. And then you think of white women in feminism, and I'm somebody who went to Beijing for the Fourth World Conference, representing Australia. So you know I played in this game. But when you talk about women wanting to go out to work, the question you ask is, who is doing their work at home? And the answer for many white feminists is being a Black woman doing that work at home. So this that we are doing is saying, let us also come to the fore because we've got it as much as you've got it. That's for me for now. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much, Juliana. There's a lot of points, a lot of love for those comments too in the chat section. And I do ask participants to also feel free to ask questions that you have of the panelists, because we are going to allocate time directly to them in about 20 minutes or so. Next off, Kali, when I ask you this question, why now? Why does this research matter, and what difference could it possibly make?
I'm coming from Gadigal land, so I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians. And I think for me, as an Aboriginal woman and somebody who's, worked across a variety of sectors over my professional career, including, non-government and government, and where I am now in terms of deadly connections was I got sick of asking for a seat at the table. I built my own table. And that I think is really, really vital in terms of from a women of colour perspective, but also from a First Nations perspective where, we know the difference that Aboriginal community controlled organisations make. And often when Aboriginal people are employed by other agencies, whether government or non-government, it can often become tokenistic. So I know, when I had so much to contribute and I had so much to offer in so many of my roles, but I was never taken seriously, or I was still in positions of leadership and I was told what to do rather than being asked to contribute and being asked to provide my expertise as an Aboriginal woman, as an expert of my community. It just wasn't like that. So I think, like Juliana said, why not now? I guess I want to touch a little bit on, the criminalisation of Aboriginal women and the way that criminalisation, which is often as a result of trauma and disadvantage, the trauma and disadvantage is criminalised. And once our women are criminalised, they're forever locked out of opportunities. And like Brenda said, it's not through lack of agency, it's not through lack of capability, it's through lack of opportunity. And once you have a criminal record, that excludes you from a number of opportunities, economic and otherwise. The system's designed as, I guess, a follow-on of the White Australia policy, where we continually kept out of opportunities, and that's basically what the criminalisation of Aboriginal women do. And we're the most imprisoned women across the globe at the moment. In comparison, even to the US, our women are incarcerated at a much higher rate. And a lot of the times when we're talking about opportunity, positions will be created at a lower level, entry-level positions. And what I would really like to see is I'd like to see a lot more women of colour in leadership positions, because we're leaders in our own community, and you know, we know how to get things done, and we do things when we're given the opportunity. So for me, it's so important on so many different levels, and I think I've touched on the majority of them at the moment. But it's just, you know, in the patriarchal society, I mean, the comparison for Aboriginal communities is that we are matriarchal societies. So we take our bloodlines from our mothers and our mothers' sides, and I come from a long line of strong Aboriginal women, you know, you'll always be too loud for a world that's not intent on listening to you. And that was something that I've always gotten throughout my professional career, that I'm too loud and my voice, you know, I'm too strong, but I'm not going anywhere, and I'm going to continue to empower my community to try and transition us from surviving to thriving. That's what I want to see.
Wow, great, Carly. There's a lot in there as well, and I want to explore, I mean, some of the findings that or some of the statistics you've spoken to resonate with the findings of the report that show the discrimination and racism in the workplace affecting First Nations people in Australia. It resonates a lot with that of women of colour in other capacities as well. 60%. I mean, it's fairly significant. I want to ask you, while you're still there, Carly, how can leadership then, knowing what you know and taking the lead, despite people saying that you shouldn't, you're just forging your own way and you're inserting yourself, in a sense, into a position of making change. How can allies assist you to do that with more impact?
That's a really good question. I think, you know, for Deadly Connections in particular, we don't receive recurrent government funding. So a lot of what we do relies on donations, relies on philanthropic support. And so, you know, amplifying the voices of our First Nations people, amplifying the voices of our women in particular, who are often forgotten about, and sharing the work that we're doing and why it's so important. I think a lot of people who would be in the event today would understand intrinsically how important the work is, but it's trying to get the other people to buy into that. That's what the most important thing is. So following all of our social channels, and not just us, there are a lot of amazing Aboriginal community-controlled organisations across Australia doing fantastic work. The difference between, I guess, an Aboriginal community-controlled organisation and another not-for-profit is our roots are embedded in our communities. So we are not going anywhere. We inherently understand the challenges that face our communities because we still experience them. At the moment, I'm battling, you know, I'm in public housing because that's the intergenerational disadvantage that I've been brought into. And I'm battling with housing at the moment to secure just a safe, appropriate and suitable space for me and my children in my community. And it's a struggle. So having organisations and people who can support those, you know, I'm obviously, I can speak well and I can advocate for myself, but even I'm finding it a challenge. And my concern is how many other people are they doing this to? So it's really about, you know, acknowledging the harms of systems, colonial systems. And when I say systems, I'm talking about all government departments. Following our socials, because we often advocate for change, you know, around systemic racism and around changes that need to happen, particularly on issues that disproportionately affect First Nations people. So amplifying our voices and supporting our campaigns around that. One of the really important ones for us at the moment is our Raise the Age campaign. At the moment, children as young as 10, boys and girls, can be charged with an offence and locked up in Australia. So we've been fighting for a number of years to try and get that changed. We know that if young people, you know, a lot of the young people that are justice involved have out-of-home care experience, have disadvantage, have trauma. We know that if the younger they go to jail, the more likely they are to continue that cycle into adult imprisonment. So it's really important to try and disrupt that as early as possible. We've just gotten a small grant to start a school suspension program because we know that there's the school to prison pipeline where our young people are being disadvantaged in the classroom. They're being expelled or excluded from school for long periods of time, up to 21 days sometimes, and then it's much harder for them to re-engage into education. So we often, you know, try to work with schools to prevent this from happening, but, you know, these systems are I guess a lot of people say system's broken. The system's actually doing what it is designed and intended to do, and that's to continually oppress already marginalised groups.
Yeah.
So being able to support, I guess, the work that we do in so many different ways. We're always looking for volunteers because we don't have a lot of resources. I hope that's answered your question.
It has.
Probably given a bit more
you've given us a lot there, and I think, you know, contacting Women of Colour Australia to access you and to get more information about how people can actually support you, either if it's material support or whether it's, you know, in-kind support. I think that's a great opportunity for people who are joining in today.
A good resource is also our website. We have a number of deadly ways to get involved on our website, which is www.deadlyconnections.org.au.
Thank you, Carly. I guess now to another issue, and I might bring Pilar and Mariam into this. And one of the statistics revealed from the report, going on from the research, is that almost 60% of women maintained that their workplace actually had a diversity and inclusion policy. They actually had a policy, all right? And yet we're seeing over 60% of women complain about experiencing discrimination in the workplace. So how are we arriving at such a dissonance between the theory and the practical if, you know, organisations are supposedly doing the right thing, at least on paper? So Mariam, I'll ask you first.
Thanks, Tasneem. Great point and great question. I'd say perhaps those diversity inclusion policies have failed to take an intersectional approach, and this is not necessarily uncommon. We know that increasingly corporate Australia is starting to take more of an intersectional lens, but it requires you know, it requires, dare I say, those individuals in those organisations that are leading diversity inclusion initiatives to actually call that out. Often if that lived experience doesn't exist within, you know, if that lens is not there, it often gets ignored. And we kind of applaud ourselves on more broadly our diversity inclusion initiatives. But often we ignore the fact that it's benefiting largely a specific cohort of women. And so yeah, so that's something.
Do you think that, can I just jump in there? Do you think that is predominantly because whenever we have, for the longest time in Australia, whenever we've discussed diversity, it has always been through a prism of gender? We haven't necessarily really explored the varieties of ways, which include cultural diversity, because that's just too hard.
Yeah, and while there are organisations that are starting to do that, I guess through my work at Diversity Council Australia, I see that there is more of an intersectional lens being applied now. It is long overdue, and it means that overwhelmingly there's this assumption, sometimes it's a ticker box approach of, right, we're doing gender equality, but there's a lack of ignorance around the fact that, you know, when it comes to gender equality initiatives don't actually benefit all women, and there is a level of amplified disadvantage that women of colour in particular face. So I've been in my respective positions, whether it's in my day job or board positions that I hold or speaking engagements, I'm constantly trying to raise the level of awareness around the disadvantage women of colour face in particular. Brenda alluded earlier to her, you know, reading the 100 pages or so of that report and how sobering and exhausting it is to face this. And it reminds me of some of the work I've done in the Islamophobia space, where I'd sit and read, you know, 300 pages worth of reports around women predominantly and the experiences of Islamophobia that they face more broadly in society, and some of also in the workplace. And it is very sobering. It is very exhausting as the minority to continue to champion this cause and to continue to fight this. So that's why, while the acknowledgement needs to be that women of colour face an amplified level of disadvantage, the fight cannot and the burden cannot just rest on our shoulders.
Beautifully said. Pilar, did you want to contribute to that anymore?
Yes. Look, I think, thank you for that. I think, Mariam, your points are really important. First, I want to say that to celebrate and highlight the fact that we're here today, and a few of us have been in leadership positions, is the strength, the testimony to women and the perseverance of actually being able to be in those positions of leadership and make way for others. I think it's really important to acknowledge that First Nations women and women of colour in this country, despite all the difficulties and against all the odds, we have made way. So now I think where I had a conversation, this is an example, with someone here in government, and of course I've been trying to, if you like, follow this diversity and inclusion agenda. And my question to them was, what is going to be the hardest thing for you to make a difference? And the answer to that was culture. And I thought that was really interesting, because obviously there was an acknowledgement and an acknowledgement that the culture of the place is one of the biggest impediments, and that the undertone of that is the racism that we see every day in Australia. So I think we need to be thinking and paying attention and demanding that other knowledge systems must be respected and valued. Because it's not just about trying to change diversity or get women of colour in positions of leadership. If the environment is in which those women are operating continue to perpetuate the same knowledge systems. So I think our gaze must shift. Where are we getting our inspiration? Where are we getting our theoretical frameworks to be able to make a difference? I think we've been gazing at one place and one place only. I really encourage us all to think about the Global South. Feminists from the Global South have really given us a lot of ideas, and there's a lot of examples in many places of the world how to actually work collectively and work together. And Juliana, you earlier on talked about white feminism, and I think also I feel very strongly that we need to move away from me too to we too. I way that we begin to understand that the struggles for equity are intrinsically linked, and their struggles for community justice, not just for individual justice, but community justice.
That's a great, and I know I said I was going to ask questions from the audience later, but I just have to break my own rules here. Rose has asked a question, which I think yourself and a couple of other you might want to jump in on. It says, what if leaders know that the inequity that exists via called and Indigenous women surveys are happening and not doing anything about it? Okay, so what should women of colour do when they're already feeling powerless? And what happens if an organisation is receiving awards and accolades for gender equality, but at the same time is perpetrating, I guess, discrimination against its bicultural workers? Any comments?
I have an idea here, but this may be a self-serving one because I'm a journalist. In those cases, if you've tried all the appropriate avenues and HR and the organisation isn't supporting you or putting their money where their mouth is and accepting the awards and all the accolades, I say it's time to leak it to the press. And it doesn't mean that you have to do it in a way that's public. You don't have to do it in a way where you go on social media and you do a screen grab of a memo or something. But there's nothing that, especially the big corporates, like or dislike more than really bad press, particularly because there is a lot of money and investment in D&I strategies at the moment, be it places like, Telstra's and your Qantas's and the banks and universities. So if the right avenues aren't working, I'd suggest new ones. I mean, it's not for everyone.
I would say with that, there's always, though, the risk of what are the repercussions going to be to me post this job if I end up leaving this job because it's just so uncomfortable.
But I'm saying you don't necessarily need to do it in a public way. I mean, it's hard to put your name and your job on the line when you know that a woman of colour already faces so many more barriers. And if you are in a professional field or with have some authority or leadership, it's hard to give that up because we know, the facts show, the data shows that's rare to even hold those positions. But there are ways to do it. Media Diversity Australia, as an example, we're all journalists of colour and we have skin in the game, and we want to be able to help people in those situations, you know, get those stories out. I mean, that's one avenue. It's not for everybody, you know, and some may leave an organisation. I mean, I have left an organisation that I felt wasn't going to nurture me and my whole identity and what I brought to the table. And it was quite a culturally unsafe space. And I, at that time, was too young in my career to feel I could do anything about it. So I left. And I know Carly earlier said that, you know, she created a new table because she wouldn't get a seat at the table. That's both inspiring and infuriating. Like, it's inspiring that you're able to do that, and clearly a woman of so many talents and strengths, but it's freaking infuriating that you won't be given a seat at the table, so you have to fucking build one. So I was like, profanities, that's the end of my profanities.
No, it's true. It's true. It is both a combination of, you know, you feel a combination of high five and face palm, because that's where we're at right now. Thank you, Antoinette. That was great. I want to leap into another question, which is on semantics. So, and Juliana, I'd like your insight on this. So, I mean, 70% of respondents to this research were young women, 25 to 34, who tend to be higher income earners in some cases, and probably educated too for the most part. They've engaged in this survey, and they've participated and shared their voice and their views. And, you know, in some ways, those who developed the survey were wondering, is this something to do with the terminology of the words women of colour in the actual concept? Because I mean, I've come across elderly women, sometimes European migrants, for example, who took great offence to me singling out my experiences as a woman of colour and some of the discrimination I felt. And they said, don't you realise by saying those words, don't you realise by saying women of colour, you're excluding all of us? And just say it's women. Just say it's women. You don't have to bring colour into this. And my response was, well, because of your reaction, this is exactly why I'm bringing colour into this. You know, that's why I'm bringing it in, which obviously she didn't take too well to that. But I thought, and now we have this research and we have predominantly young people. How do we bring in, because we know, and as you have mentioned, we know that this is the experience for older women of colour in Australia, but why is there reticence around usage of this word, and how do we get them on board? Do we change, or do they change?
Thank you, Tasneem. For me, as an older, and I'm an older woman, you know that.
So am I, don't worry, we're all together.
For me, as an older woman, today, before today, I would say, for me, as an older Black African woman, the phrase women of color did not resonate with me at all. And I had a lot of conversations with younger women, other women of color who are not accepting of the phrase, who are also in leadership and really working around, what is this? Where is it coming from? What does it mean? And I came to make a difference and feel confident to even come onto this panel by researching. So the point of the matter is, we are not resonating with the concept because we don't understand. And also because we don't know where it came from. Because it just happened on us. Overnight, everybody is talking about women of color. Where does it come from? Why don't we investigate concepts before we use them? So my point for us here going forward is, the biggest role for women of color Australia to engage in the next few months is education. Education amongst women of color about women of color, about the concept itself. Then we can get women of color of all ages, of all iterations, to gather behind the concept, to accept it, to own it, and to work with it.
How do we make that pivot from being a term which is seen to have negative connotations to one which is actually one of empowerment? Because I think it's fair to say we feel empowered by that concept.
Yeah,
but I just think it's a liability. How do we flip that?
Well, I think until we've all come to own it and work with it, it will continue to be a liability. But if we own it, we can cancel the term culturally and linguistically diverse and replace it with women of color. It have to be an orchestrated process amongst us. It really has to be, because it just takes a few points of education to change the mindset and get us moving with that. And we need to, because this happened in 1977, and it's time that Australia really got onto that bandwagon as well. It's really not a bandwagon, but it is a bandwagon, yeah.
I agree, and I will add here that, you know, we need education, you know, be it generational or across different community groups and cultural groups. You know, I know, and I've spoken to some Indigenous people who don't appreciate Indigenous women being lumped in under the same umbrella as women of colour, because their experiences are so much more unique. Their barriers are so much higher, and, you know, the impacts of colonialism continue to be felt in a way that other women of colour don't feel. And so I know the term is problematic. Once upon a time, it was NESB, non-English speaking background. Some people have a problem with cultural and linguistically diverse and want it removed. Even someone in the comments said, what about multiculturalism? That has been politicised and weaponised by conservative governments to be the death of, you know, the Australian way of life. So, I mean, language is important, owning it and wearing it as a badge of honour before it's turned against us, because it's a matter of time before it's going to, just like the Black Lives Matter became an all lives matter, and before we knew it, our Deputy Prime Minister was using it to, you know, using very similar language to white supremacists. So I think understanding and owning the language is super important, because it's only a matter of time before it's going to be weaponized to try and put us in our place or put us back in our box.
Thank you, Antoinette.
I wanted to just add something to that point, Mariam, here. So irrespective, I think, of the language that we use, and there's been lots of debate around what's appropriate, what's inclusive, etc. But the key thing here is that the majority will always kind of probably potentially, there's going to be a level of resistance to the terminology that we use, no matter how empowered that we feel like, that we might feel. And it reminds me of that quote that equality feels like oppression to those that are used to a level of privilege. And that's ultimately what it is. Irrespective of what terminology we adopt, there will always be resistance, there will always be backlash, and there will always be the, well, what about me? I've also been called a quote unquote wog when I was younger. I've faced a lot of, you know, spoken to lots of women who constantly remind me that, yes, I've felt exclusion and I've faced racism, but, you know, so did they several decades ago, and therefore it's the same. And I think we just have to respectfully say, no, it's not. It does not mean that you facing a level of discrimination when you were younger is somehow, you know, it's not a competition. But at the end of the day, we also need to call out that women of minority backgrounds, and particularly non-European women, if we want to get really specific, right, the Australian Human Rights Commission, the approach they've taken around tracking and measuring cultural diversity in the exclusion communities face is by actually drilling down into specifically your background. So we know those of an Anglo-Celtic and those of a European background disproportionately overrepresented in leadership positions. And then when you look at those women and men of non-European backgrounds, which is a huge category, and of also Indigenous backgrounds, that there is disproportionate representation. So, you know, if the language is always, there's always going to be a level of resistance, and it's just about, I think, calling it out. And the reference to the table thing that was mentioned earlier, I really do love that comment. And in my mind, however, depending on whatever role you're currently in, if you do happen to have a seat at the table, whilst it becomes, you know, it becomes incredibly frustrating to the point that you want to create your own table, where possible, as much as possible, so many, I would urge women that have the opportunity to continue pushing against that table that you're currently in. Because yes, we can go and create our own tables, but hell, why the hell should we have to? Why can't we, you know, insist and demand that our voices be listened to? And I don't for a second try to pretend that that's easy. It is ultimately about power and about privilege. And, you know, earlier on in my career, there was many opportunities where I wished I said something, but I didn't. And now when I reflect back, I feel that all of those experiences have added to my strength and resilience. And now I'm in a position where I will say something, and I will be careful about it, and I'll be strategic about it. Yes, all of those things, but I'm not going to just sit back and watch. And I think part of that is because I'm able to utilise a level of privilege I didn't have before. It's also about really using our networks of other women of colour to empower us, because as soon as you start saying, hey, I experienced this today, I can guarantee you, you know, almost all these other women around you will be like, yep, I've been there, I've done that. And we actually can help support each other. If you are in an organisation where you are seeing something and you want to call it out, but you are worried about the ramifications to you, see if you can look for cover. And what I mean is identify other women that are within, you know, senior positions in that organisation that you could go to outside of HR, that you can, you know, confidentially approach, and particularly if they're women of colour, and say, look, I'm experiencing this thing, what do you recommend I do? And if you can get cover.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it kind of links in a way, segues neatly into the concept of mentors or having support people in the workplace. And Kat, can I bring you in here and ask you, what structures, if in the absence of there being structures to support women of colour in a workplace, how would you advise a young woman experiencing this frustration, or this bind of not having a supportive mechanism that she can go to? You know, Mariam's saying, you know, rather than build your own, you know, rather than having to build our own table, make one at work. I mean, I think the reality is for a lot of women, especially those who are younger, going through the early stages of their career and sort of encountering discrimination, they will have two tables. There will be the table that they sit at work, which could be very exclusionary, and then there'll be the table that they could find through this platform, where they can come and debrief and get support. But how do we find support mechanisms in the workplace?
That's a really good question. I think I've seen a couple of examples of organisations creating working groups and subcommittees of D&I working groups that are specifically for women of colour. So I would say that is a really great way to connect with other women of colour in your organisation. I think, you know, I agree with Juliana that the term women of colour it's an education piece. I absolutely agree that we need to, you know, we've only just started using this term and we need to stick with it. It actually came out of America. America uses women of colour a lot in consulting documentation and their research to identify, you know, the group of women that are African American, Asian American, American Indian, and other people of colour. So it is very much an American term. In the UK, they use the term BAME, so Black and Minority Ethnic. So each, you know, jurisdiction around the world uses different terms, but I think women of colour, we've, you know, you've established the organisation, hold on to it, keep going, because it will catch on, and it is already catching on. So if women of colour in organisations are not finding the support they need, then build your own little networks within your organisation. Yeah. So there's lots of us that are leaders, and so create a network. You know, stand up and be that leader in your organisation. So what I did was I left organisations and started working for myself. So that's the solution I chose for myself. But those of you that are working within large institutions, create your own support networks. That's what I would say. So you can be the change from within the organisation. The other thing is what we need to understand is that the White Australia policy underpins almost all institutions developed in this country. White Australia policy started in 1901 and it ended around 69. Apparently it ended around 69. So for that 70-year period, all of the institutions in Australia that were launched and built were designed under a White Australia policy. So white supremacy is embedded within our institutions, the notion of white supremacy. So in order to undo that, it almost feels as though we need 70 years of a different kind of policy to unravel the damage that's been done by the White Australia policy.
That's a good statement to start off my next question, I think. Thank you, Kat. That's a lot of There's a lot of grounding there. There's a question here, which, Pilar, I might ask you to chat in on. We've discussed workplaces and Women of Colour Australia's survey that shows Australian employers need to do much more to make the workplaces inclusive and culturally safe. What about policymakers? In the panel's opinion, what is the one thing government decision makers can and should do to ensure Australian women of colour are able to participate and contribute and thrive professionally? What can they do better? Pilar.
Yeah. Let me say first, before I answer that question, that if we look at social movements across the globe, the rights that we've acquired over time, they've never been given to communities have been minoritized. People have to struggle hard and propose changes. So I guess by default, I'm saying that, that nobody's going to give us the rights on a plate. We're going to have to create solidarity and work together and create those opportunities to sit at the table. And that's really important. And I also believe that there'll be some people who will be sympathetic. And also we see there are some women of color in politics. And obviously we want women of color in a diverse range of forums. So actually we have that kind of level of representation. But look, we know that quotas work. That is something that the Labor Party has instituted, and the Liberal Party, the government, has been kicking and screaming to the point that actually they have to do something, and sometimes a blunt instrument, of course it is. So quotas are important. I think we are like to see in a private and public sector that there is specific quotas for individuals so that we begin to shift the culture, because ultimately, and I think at your point, I will go to the extent to say that the White Australia policy, it's here. It has not been fully dismantled. There has been disguise in different ways, and that in fact, it manifests today in the government insistence in not allowing the Wallumattagal family to stay in Australia, in manifesting incarceration rates of Aboriginal people, and the list goes on. So I think against that backdrop, it really, to me, why this organization is important, it's because it begins to establish a dialogue and begins to change the narrative. So, and I think language is important, and I think, Juliana, you had some really great points in that. I think the language failed us, to be honest. I believe that language is never quite catching up with where we need to go, but we need to be curious, and we need to be diligent, and we need to do our research. So actually we can move the language along too. And who knows, maybe in 10 years we won't call ourselves that. But for now, it's the best we have in an imperfect world. Yes.
Thank you, Pilar.
Can I add?
Yeah, sure.
Can I add to that? In terms of the role policy plays, I mean, it plays crucial, an absolutely essential role. I think both politics and the media. So the way we talk about issues around race, most of the country is still uncomfortable even saying the word racism. It sends people into this fit of oh, this doesn't exist, how dare you? And then it ends up becoming a big session about how wounded a person feels because you dare utter the word. So I think, to build on so many excellent points from before, Mariam's point about where possible stay at the table. We need people at the table in politics and in policy, working in media, who have a voice when we have these discussions about changes to our Discrimination Act, or the stupidity of allowing someone like Barnaby Joyce to join the Women's Task Force. We need people in those positions of powers, both who shape the narrative and who shape policy and legislation. So it's so important. And I think also, to echo the sentiment, is we need quotas. We need to, because we know it's not a meritocracy. We know people can't get there. It's not because we're not smart enough or not good enough. It's because the system, and again, touching on a point just raised, the white supremacist system and the White Australia policy in many ways is still in place, prohibiting, fair and equitable access to people. So I think we definitely need to ensure that we're at the table and making noise, both, in a political arena and the media arena when it comes to issues impacting people of colour. Also, just a quick step back about what to do if you're in an organisation and you don't feel that your organisation or HR is supporting you. We talked about, I talked about leaking it to the media, but we also talked about, finding other people of colour to be there as a sounding board, or other people who have influence, or someone who can help you navigate your experience. But also don't underestimate the important role white allies play in this space. And sometimes they're white men. So one of my greatest career champions has been a white guy who has helped me navigate mainstream and commercial media as a mother, as a woman of colour, and sometimes when other people of colour fail to. So I think it's an important role you have to play in terms of trying to understand and read the room and who your allies are, and sometimes align yourself with power when you truly believe and trust that person of power has your back. And so I think that's another way to navigate it. I did want to say something that to go back a little bit earlier about that 60% figure, which I think is horrendous, but I also think it's low. I think it's probably unrepresentative because, as we talked about, the age group, 20 to 40, and people largely earning decent salaries and also in white collar work, that doesn't take into consideration women in precarious, casualised service industry work, women whose visa statuses don't enable them to have professional roles in white collar organisations. So I would say, if anything, that figure is on the low side.
I would agree. And I think we know that from our hospitality, from our caring industry, services that are overwhelmingly female and certainly underpaying, is definitely female dominated, and women of colour at that point. Look, I'm going to jump to one of the questions that's sort of been asked a couple of times in different iterations, and I might bring you into this one. Where's she gone? We're missing where's our deadly connection?
I'm here.
There you are. Okay, good. I wanted to ask you, do we have, or should we have, an entity or a body that would unionise the women of colour entity, do you think? So that in workplaces, when there were issues of discrepancy and or discrimination, or, unfair treatment of workers, there was some sort of entity like a union for women of colour that women could go to advocate on their behalf. Do you think that would work, or do you think it would just be siloed as something that's irrelevant and another little political grandstanding by those women that talk too much?
I think we definitely, there's been a lot of talk on this panel around support and finding your allies and all of that stuff. But I think what I really, really want to reiterate on the panel is self-care. It's so important that we care for each other and care for ourselves. It's a really, really hard lesson that I've had to learn. And I think, finding women who have been through it, women who have come out the other side, whatever that looks like. And, some of the wins are not necessarily huge, but they're small steps in the right direction. I think, I talked about building my own table, and I think it was Antoinette talk about we shouldn't have to do that. And she's completely right. But for me, I was in a government department and I was one person. So I had to decide, do I continue this fight at the detriment of my mental health, or do I accept that I can't change these colonial systems from the inside out? I'll do it from the outside in. That was my sort of turning point, where I decided that I'm not going to keep giving so much of myself. And at the time, mind you, I was actually acting in 3 roles, but only being paid for 1. And I was pregnant as well. Looking back, I don't even know how I got through that difficult time, but it was through allies. It was through accomplices. We don't use the term ally, we use the term accomplice, because we feel that ally is can be a little bit superficial, whereas an accomplice, you're in there in the trenches getting your hands dirty as much as everyone else. So I don't know if I've answered your question directly, but, I think unions have a place. And I don't know, maybe it's the terminology that I'm not comfortable with, but I totally understand the concept of that. And I think that would be helpful to create, maybe through this forum or another one, in different sectors of support groups for women. So, you know, it might be media, it might be caring services, whatever it might look like, a union type of arrangement, but maybe not calling it a union.
Carly, I just wanted to respond. Thank you so much for your honesty and your vulnerability. I guess I wasn't for a second suggesting that you shouldn't walk away from the table, more that it was so frustrating that you had to. And 100%. Absolutely self-care, because if we don't look after ourselves, this fight and the challenge is bigger than you, it's bigger than I. And I think we're such a key player, especially an Indigenous woman like you, is such a key player in this. And we need to do everything we can to empower and support you. So I just wanted to ensure that you want
totally. And I didn't think that that's what you were saying, but I think it's important to understand and to acknowledge when we're in these battles, can we keep fighting them in a way that's not going to impact on us and our role in our communities and our families and our role as women and for our own mental health? You know, is this a battle that we're going to fight right now and that we're going to get any change? Because some places are structured to be impenetrable, you know what I mean? Like if we're not going to get anywhere, where else could our energy be focused? I think it's that's been really hard for me, because I'm an Aries, so I find it really hard to go, you know, like, have I done everything that I possibly can to affect the change that I want to see? Is it worth me putting more energy into this, or is it worth me fighting the fight but in another way? And I think that's, for me, that was a really, really important and hard lesson, because I spent the better part of 10 years working for different government departments in senior level positions where I was still being told what to do and not valued for the expertise and the lived experience and everything that I had to offer.
Well, if anything, I think this panel has demonstrated is that whether you're working in your individual capacity from the outside in, or whether you're still inside fighting in the trenches, know that you are supported, and there is at least a platform where you can reach out to, if not for debriefing, just for some mental health and well-being too, so you can actually get back on track and know that you're not making this up. This report and the outcomes of this survey demonstrate that the racism that women of colour are enduring in the workplace is lived reality. It's not something they made up. It's not something they've imagined. It is actually what is happening. And as Antoinette inferred, it probably is significantly higher than what the data tells us, because we know that, again, that the cohort who participated were fairly young. It hasn't even accounted for maybe as much of the over 40 cohort, which we need to look into, I think, as a separate piece. But as we sort of near towards the end, there's so much there. I just want to give each of the panelists, and I can see Pilar has a hand up, I want to give each of the panelists just an opportunity, I guess, to close with, where to from now? Okay, so we know why now, but where to from here, knowing what we do, feeling the passion. And I got to say, the comments and those contributing they're just so engaging, and there's just so much there. There's just so much rage and solidarity at once. And I think that kind of reflects the tone of this group. It's we're angry, but we're also committed to justice and change. So in the spirit of that, Pilar, what would be your closing comments? You're on mute.
Sorry. Look, I think it's something that maybe this is another conversation, another forum, but it's really important that we think about the kind of leadership that we want to exercise, because I think the last thing that we want is to generate patterns and modes of leadership that actually have been working against us. And we haven't kind of touched on that. And I think this is something, we've got something to some level of information that we can work, and we need to scrutinize that data, and we need much more information. But my next piece, really, we need to be thinking about what kind of leadership and mentoring programs can we actually offer for women to advance not only themselves, but our communities. I think that's really critical.
Yeah, very practical. Thank you. Kat, what's your 1 minute wrap up?
My 1 minute wrap up is for all of these amazing women in leadership, amazing women of colour in leadership. If you're looking for your next challenge, I would say policy is great, but legislation is even better. So consider getting into politics. At the moment, we have one woman of colour in New South Wales Parliament. There are no Aboriginal women in New South Wales Parliament. In Parliament, that is where all of the laws that govern us are made. And if our voices are not there, whether it's local government, whether it's state government. If our voices are not there, if we're not represented, then how are we going to change systems, right? So for me, seeing more amazing women like you all on the panel and the amazing women in this, in this forum, seeing more of your faces in politics, that will affect the change from the top down. And I think that's definitely something to consider for all of us. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Antoinette, your final comment.
Well, I have to, but I'll stay within 1 minute. Firstly, I'm so inspired by all of you, and thank you for this opportunity, Brenda. And honestly, if ever you're all in Sydney, I'd love to have you all over for dinner. There's one thing brown women can do is put on a good meal. And so I would honestly love to continue this conversation over food. Secondly, for everybody else wondering what to do next, one of the things I talk about in my book, which is coming out soon, is to be okay with finding your niche and focusing on something, because the magnitude of the problem can be so overwhelming. There's, incarceration of Indigenous women, lack of representation, racism on the streets, bullying. There's so much domestic violence. Find your niche and the area that you want to champion and put your energy towards and focus on that, because I think otherwise it can be overwhelming, too easy to go, what can one lone wolf do in all of this? So for me, I've decided that media and challenging media narratives, I've been asked to run for office, I've been asked to do a bunch of other things, but I just have to go, you know what, that's not for me, or not now, and my focus is on this, and be unapologetic about it, look after yourself, and just find that one little thing, one little cog in the wheel that you can challenge.
Well said. Thank you. Next, we'll go to Mariam.
Thanks, Tasneem, and great points, Antoinette. Where to from here? I'd say we talked about supporting other women, women of colour. So look, simple thing, add me on LinkedIn right now. So let's continue to build our network. I managed to get to where I am, and I still have ambitions to go further because other women chose to support me. So I'm very much trying to do the same and return the favour. When women continue to support other women, amazing things can happen. So add me on LinkedIn to the extent that you're looking for a particular position. I even say to people, send me your resume. Don't expect a reply. My inbox and schedule is insane, but let's try. The other thing is, I've always mentioned this in a lot of my speeches, this idea that fathers with daughters apparently run more progressive organisations. So CEOs that have daughters run more progressive organisation. I say that is fantastic, but you shouldn't wait to have skin in the game in order to care about gender equality or care about cultural diversity or racial diversity or any form of diversity. You don't need to wait to have that lived experience. So merit is not this thing that's disproportionately allocated to people of a European or an Anglo-Celtic background. We have merit, women of colour have merit, and we've just got to demand our place at that table, as I mentioned. So yeah, if there's one thing, add me on LinkedIn. Let's continue to support each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. Carly, your last comment.
Look, I really want to thank Brenda for inviting me to this event today. I would have really loved to see everyone in person, but I'm happy that it's gone ahead and we've been able to have this really, really important conversation. I'd really like to see this conversation continue. I'd like to see this support network build on its strength and, I guess, purpose. I echo, I think it was Mariam. Everybody add me on LinkedIn, but also, follow us on Instagram at Deadly Connections, follow us on Facebook at Deadly Connections. We're also on Twitter at DeadlyCCAJS. I'll put all of this in the chat for you guys. And, if there's any way, we're so under-resourced, in many areas in terms of Deadly Connections. And if there's any pro bono support that anybody wants to offer, we're very open to working with everybody. Our aim is to build an army because we can't, Antoinette said, we can't do this on our own. We need to stick together and we need to support each other. And I guess I just want to send, healing and love to everyone because it's needed, and it's such a hard fight, but it's a very important one. And, I want to acknowledge all of the women that came before us that have been fighting this for years and years and years, particularly, you know, my matriarchal lines, my grandmother in particular. I hope I can be half of the woman that she was. So thanks, everyone. I really appreciate being here.
Beautiful. Thank you, Carly. And Juliana, please.
Thank you.
Closing comment.
Thank you, Tasneem. Oh, yeah, I'm off mute. Okay. So this is a couple of things I'll say. I wouldn't go long. I'll say that as a woman who works from within the human rights framework, today I ask not only for my rights, but for justice. I have left workplaces just for my sanity and for the sanity of my family. I have very, very close friends who have left workplaces not knowing where to go, because we live in a country that does not language racism. And as a result of that, a lot of us suffer in silence. But as a leader, what I want to do from here is I'm going to, and I've started already working with my group of women to understand who we are, but then to move away from the identity politics and join hands with all women of color so that in solidarity, we can move forward. Boy, I don't know about you, but this country doesn't know what is up for once we've moved forward together in solidarity. Thank you.
Oh, wow, Juliana, I like that very call to arms by Stella. That's absolutely amazing. And it's what we needed to hear. I don't know about you, but this has been such an unexpected joy. I knew it was going to be good, but not fantastically, just so inspiring. Thank you all for joining us from across the country. I noticed we even had one guest from Sri Lanka. So, I mean, we are really expanding our reach here. There have been, and if you get the chance, I invite you to please try and scan through some of the comments, both the questions and the statements of solidarity that people have shared about their own expressions and frustrations. I think if nothing else, it's demonstrated there is definitely a need to do this again, perhaps on a more regular basis. Of course, this was our launch. COVID had other plans that kept us from being together in person. And you know, the irony is I always thought it would be Melbourne that would be cancelling an event, but it was Sydney, just saying. I'm a Melbourne person, so feeling a little bit of told you so right now. Thank you to Brenda, for the team at Women of Colour Australia for putting this together. It has been a phenomenal event. There are so many thoughts running through my head, from shaking up the pyramid to building our own table to burning it all down where we need to and starting again. I think the board members of Women of Colour, the panellists today, and the really inspired and highly tuned in participants have demonstrated that we're ready for the task ahead. So I would probably want to end with just a thank you to our sponsors, which were Multicultural New South Wales, and also I think women at VU Consulting and CAT's organisation as well, which I apologise, I've forgotten the name of that organisation. But so
Women's Business.
Women's Business. Thank you so much to all three of our sponsors for enabling today. Brenda in particular, for putting this all together and having to pivot with such skill on taking this whole thing online with an amazing turnout, participation and enthusiasm. So the last thing I'm going to do is have a little bit of a quote, and that is to say there was an Indigenous activist in the 1970s attended the UN Conference for Women in Nairobi, Lila Watts. And she famously said, "If you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound with mine, then let us work together." And I think that kind of epitomizes the attitude and the energy of where women of colour are. So thank you for joining us. Please feel free to support the efforts of what this organisation is doing. Brenda is going to provide a link both on their website and in your socials about how you can financially support us. There was a goal of $1,000, which we were aiming to get to support this event and others like it. I think we're around nearly at the $700 mark, so we're almost at our goal. Please feel free to support that. Follow everyone on LinkedIn, because I think we've all got a handle of some sort. And if you were going to hashtag anything from today, it was hashtag WOC leadership. Yeah, so follow us on Twitter. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tasneem. Thank you, Brenda.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.